We had a guest on in conversation recently, Professor Merton Miller, financial economist. He said that the Asian economic crisis was a result of the breakdown of the banking system in Asia, more a currency issue. Whereas in your view, it was, you know, the fact that it was the Asian way of doing things that landed us in this mess that we're in right now. Now, do you think that's too simplistic a view?
Oh, absolutely not, no. I mean, Merton Miller's views are merely a component of what I would say. I mean, sure, the banks have broken down, they've done, you know, just appalling things, really crazy, absurd things. And you have to look, well, why have they done this? And the reason is because you have many banks across the region lending money inappropriately to their friends, to their relatives, and so on, without any due risk analysis. In Korea, you've had the government has ordered the banks to lend money inappropriately. In China, banks have been ordered to lend money to bad debtors deliberately. And all these things are basically covered in my book. So all these are a function of the ways of, say, doing business in much, not all, but much of Asia, which is outmoded, it's not modern, and it's not appropriate. Now, it's not necessarily Asian versus Western or something like that, because, of course, the obvious exception is Singapore. You know, Singapore has, by and large, not done this. And Singapore is very Asian. At least it obviously presents itself as very Asian. And so, given that you have one very important exception to the rule, it therefore means that it's not so much an Asian problem really, but it really is a problem of not being modern enough or not being efficient enough and so on.
Now, you've mentioned Singapore many times in your book. Why do you think Singapore is the way it is today?
The institutions here, and I think there was a lot of depth to the early cabinets, and of course there's a lot of depth now, but you know, the early framers of Singapore were just so important. You know, particularly the work of Dr. Goh Keng Swee was crucial in setting up the economy and the rules and the legal structures and whatever, and to continue the good aspects of the British system, particularly when it comes to doing business here. That's very important. And the emphasis on education, again, you know, human capital formation, really important. And you know, that is infrastructure, of course, is important as well. So these things about Singapore, the media here, you know, often the media can be criticised, but I would say that when it comes to business, the coverage here of local business issues is really very good compared with what happens in a lot of you know, the rest of Asia, and all of these things help to ensure that companies do the right thing. And so, I mean, I really see Singapore, you know, this red dot in the green sea. I see the red dot as a red beacon, and something for perhaps the green sea to learn from. Now, of course, you can't say that because I get very angry with you, but perhaps someone like me, an outsider, can suggest these things more readily. And but there's a lot to be learned from Singapore. But I'm not saying that Singapore is perfect. Of course, it's not, because no country is perfect.
One of the quotes in your book, there is no such thing as an Asian way in the global age. There's a right way and a wrong way, and the Asian way is the wrong way. Some critics have said that this is too arrogant of you. What do you say?
Oh, too bad. There is only one way now in the age of globalization. You know, I'm sorry. When you've got capital whizzing around the world and it can basically pull out of this market, go into that market and so on, it will respect only transparency, good corporate governance and so on. If you don't have those things, you don't have much. You will lose out. And if you look at how Singapore has been affected in the Asian crisis, you know, it has a lot of these things, you know, in a quite positive way relative to its neighbours. Australia as well has you know, a fairly good record when it comes to accountability and corporate governance and so on. And if you look at Australia and Singapore's performance in the crisis, well, last year Singapore did about -1 economic growth. Australia is currently growing at around 5% in the face of that country's trading partners having collapsed. It rapidly swapped around to, say, American and European trading partners. Now, when you consider that basically when Asia has been burning, Australia has been booming. it really demonstrates the importance of institutions and sound legal structures and good corporate governance. Now, you can still be Asian, but that doesn't mean you have to run your companies in a very non-transparent way. And at the end of the day, the prime beneficiaries of having good corporate governance, good transparency and good accountability are people who live here, people who live in Asia, because many Asian people are minority shareholders in a lot of these countries. Now, if you don't have a good record on these things, you just have other Asian people being ripped off. There is a general lack of ethics and a lack of decency in how much of business has been conducted in many parts of Asia. If you look at how business was being conducted in Jakarta, it was completely indecent. It was unethical. And again, if you look at what was in China, in Thailand, Korea, and so on, it comes down to almost a question of morals as well. And so I think there's been a breakdown in morals. Now, often we have this whole thing of Asian values and how decadent the West is, but nothing could be more indecent than the way in which business has been conducted in much of Asia. Full stop. That's how it is. I mean, it is not moral and it is not decent to absolutely rip off minority shareholders, to take in money from small investors, whether it's people living in Thailand, people who've been saving up money, housewives and so on in Bangkok, who invest on the local stock exchange and then find that their money completely disappears. It's stolen from them by the majority shareholders. Now, this sort of thing has been replicated right across Asia. The cost of this has been other Asian people. I mean, it's the hurt in Asia, the corporate crime has been against other Asians. Look at the number of people across this region who've lost their jobs, or they've lost their savings, and so on. It's it really comes down to decency as much as anything else.
Now let's move on to Indonesia, where you spent a bit of time there. Yeah, Indonesia is now entering the second or third stage, depending on whether you looked at the May riots as the first phase of political reform. What's your reading of the current situation there?
I think that a lot of people are going to be very disappointed with what has happened with the elections and so on. A lot of Indonesians are going to be very disappointed because it really makes little sense to have a democratic election when you don't have the rule of law. And if you don't have the rule of law whereby everyone in the country, no matter who they are and how big they are, is equal before the law, well then you'll simply swap one nepotistic dictator for another. And I think that what the so-called democratic process is doing in Indonesia without an appropriate rule of law is doing exactly that. There will be nothing to stop the next president of that country, whether it's Habibie or Megawati or whoever, from simply doing what the other previous leaders have done, including Habibie and Zahara and so on, and a great deal of the rest of the cabinet and so on.
Do you think Megawati will become president?
At the moment, I would probably say I think Habibie has a slightly better chance than Megawati.
Do you think he will be quite successful in brokering this deal that will keep him in power?
What I would say is that from now until the November presidential election, there's a lot of time for a lot of horse trading, a lot of swapping of favours, a lot of transfers of money left, right and centre, and that of course a lot of promises to the military. That makes it very hard to predict who's going to win outright. In that sort of situation where there is a lot of money, presumably that will be changing hands, and I have no doubt that it will be, given Indonesia's history, you would have to say that Golkar and the presidential candidate for Golkar would have to have a better chance than most.
So we're almost back to status quo?
Oh, I think so. Again, because without the rule of law, you have nothing. Without the rule of law, democracy in Indonesia will simply get a bad name. If Megawati becomes president, what I would say is that her husband has already shown nepotistic tendencies by having so many of his relatives standing in the election, inappropriately so. He's already described in the media as a businessman. Now, in a way, it would appear as if history might possibly repeat itself. I mean, Megawati could become the Korea Kino, if you like, of Indonesia, but she could also become the Benazir Bhutto with a profligate husband in tow. So, but again, without the rule of law, whereby you can bring Megawati, if she does develop in the wrong way, to book, to account, well then Indonesia will have nothing. They'll be back to where they started.
What do you think will be the outcome of investigations on former President Suharto's wealth?
I don't think there'll be much of an outcome. You're not going to get a full independent inquiry into that. There are too many there with a vested interest to ensure that there isn't a full inquiry. I think there's going to, or there is right now, a lot of window dressing. Perhaps they're charging Tommy, for example, on some minor charges, some minor allegations, and it's to appease the masses. I don't see it as it's certainly not a full-on grappling with the situation. I mean, I think by and large the Suhartos have gotten away with it, and I would say that over the next 5 to 10 years that the Suharto conglomerates will re-emerge as very significant players within the Indonesian economy, perhaps with different names, perhaps with different management, but you'll still, in a roundabout way, still find that the Suharto family will have the equity there.
Now, you said in your book that you're very pessimistic about Asia, especially Indonesia. Does that still hold?
Look, I'm very pessimistic about any country that doesn't get the institutions right. They matter so much. The rule of law is so important. Sound corporate governance is incredibly important. Without that, you do not have the prime determinant of economic growth. And if you look at what Hong Kong is doing right now, they are going backwards very quickly. With this decision to refer the Hong Kong quarterfinal appeals decision recently to China for a reinterpretation, that is just ridiculous. I mean, it's as if Hong Kong has learnt nothing at all about the value of institutions from the whole economic crisis. I mean, that decision is like having maybe the Prime Minister of Singapore being not happy with a High Court decision here and then referring that decision to Jakarta, going from one of Asia's best legal systems and getting a reinterpretation from one of Asia's worst. Now that is it's a huge backward.
Regression. Yeah.
It's an appalling regression. Hong Kong is finished as the dynamo that we know it. I mean, I believe that it is next century's Venice, if you like. It will be reduced next century to being an interesting tourist destination, perhaps with a Disney park or something like that. Living off the wealth of its erstwhile competitors. And but more broadly, the institutions are absolutely important. So any country in this region which gets its institutions right will thrive. Singapore will, get back on track and recover very quickly because it has sound institutions. Australia is doing very well. It has sound institutions. Malaysia is doing okay because for what a lot of the media outside of the country says, Malaysia still does basically have a not so bad rule of law, particularly when it comes to business litigation. So, I feel quite optimistic really for Malaysia, more optimistic than what perhaps many others feel. But for a lot of the rest of Asia, there's a long way to go.
Michael Backman, thank you so much for being on In Conversation.
Thank you.